Hello, and welcome to this talk on the architectural legacy of the Burning of Cork, which happened in December 1920. The reconstruction of the city took another 15 years. This talk was prepared for the Cork Decorative and Fine Arts Society and for Nano Nagle Place, and is supported by the Heritage Officer and Heritage Office of Cork City Council and the 2020 Audience Engagement Fund of the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. My name is Tom Spalding and I'm an architectural historian, and I'm going to be concentrating on the buildings of Cork in the 1920s and 30s. And if you want more information on the events that led up to the burning of the city and the events on the night of the 11th and 12th of December, I recommend you watch and listen to Michael Lenihan's talk on the Nano Nagle Place website. So perhaps we'll just have a little look at what St. Patrick's Street looked like before the fire. Now, this image from the National Library shows the street around the year 1900. A busy shopping street, then as now, with trams, wagons, taxis and chariots running up and down the street. As many of you may know, Patrick Street was originally a waterway. And if you look carefully in this image, you'll see that the remains of the old culvert can be seen on the left-hand side of the image. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I won't be delving deeply into the events that ran up to the burning of Cork, but I think it's safe to say that if you look over the years 1919 and 1920, there was a rolling crescendo of violence, intimidation, and destruction before the big fires in December 1920. And this fire as a weapon of war had been used by both sides in the conflict. The IRA had attacked RIC barracks and magazines to get weapons, and in retaliation, the RIC and the British Army had destroyed Sinn Féin clubs, printing presses, and areas where they thought that their enemy was assembling. So, as I said, the fires were lit deliberately on the night of the 11th and 12th of December 1920, concentrating on Cork city centre, especially Patrick Street, but also attacking the City Hall and the library, which stood on the same site of the City Hall at the time. This image, which many of you may be familiar with, shows Patrick Street shortly after the burning, and it looks very much like a war zone. Destruction, smoke, steam, damage, looting, people trying to rescue items from their own stores, people trying to make buildings safe. The large, gaunt-looking structure on the right was a chemist shop, and clearly, but somehow miraculously, the facade is still standing after the fire. This image shows the street after some cleaning up had taken place. The facade of the chemist has been taken down, and you'll notice at the top of the image that the site where Brown Thomas's or Cash's now stands has been completely cleared. And there are also two little sheds standing on Patrick Street that represent the former sites of the MUNSTER Arcade and other businesses on the street. Now, this was as much about marking territory to remind people that there was actually a business here, because once the businesses were gone, it was quite hard to determine what actually stood where. This map from the Irish Labour Party report shows the extent of the damage of the city. In red are buildings that were completely destroyed, and in orange, buildings which were badly or partially destroyed. In total, 5 acres of the city were destroyed. There were 55 commercial premises completely destroyed, including well-known places like Roach's, Egan's, Grant's, the MUNSTER Arcade, the Lee Cinema, and the City Hall and Library, which I mentioned. A further 20 were badly damaged, necessitating in most cases their demolition, and 12 more were badly wrecked and looted, especially along what is now Oliver Plunkett Street. Thankfully, and somewhat amazingly, nobody was killed in the fire itself. The fire brigade managed to rescue everybody who was trapped in the upper floors of the buildings which were set on fire. A very unfortunate woman died of a heart attack when her house was raided by the police, and the two Delaney brothers were killed in further reprisals by British forces. The real loss, I suppose, to the city was the commercial buildings and the city hall. But the commercial buildings were partly residential, a feature that's completely missing from the modern city. So as well as these 5 acres of destruction, 200 people were rendered homeless and 2,000 people lost their jobs. This is just before Christmas, 1920. The stores were stacked with Christmas goods. And so the situation was very grave. Now, I suppose in situations like this, it isn't really that helpful to think about winners and losers, but it's worth pondering it for a little while. In the medium term, the winners of this conflict, this event, were the IRA and people seeking self-determination in Ireland. This was a disaster for the British establishment in terms of public relations, as we would call it today. But initially, the winners were these happy chaps here, members of the RIC. Now, this photograph is actually from 1921, but they achieved what they set out to do. They felt that they had retaliated for things that had happened to them, and they stole large amounts of precious jewelry, watches, luxury clothing, and alcohol. So in the very, very short term, they felt happy with their night's work, I'm sure. In the more medium term, the initial reaction in Cork was actually slightly against the IRA. The Bishop of Cork came out and partly blamed the retaliation on IRA action, and the Cork Examiner, the response that they gave was not sufficiently supportive that the IRA took the step of smashing up some of their printing presses and terrorising the printers. But as time passed and the British government started to try and fudge and cover up, people were reminded of events like the destruction of Louvain in 1914, a point which was raised in the House of Commons. The question was then, if we signed up to join the British Army in 1914 to protect small Catholic countries that were being destroyed, why now is our small Catholic country being destroyed? The greatest winners in the medium to long term were the business owners on the street, more especially the large business owners. And if you look carefully at this image, which I started the presentation with, you'll notice that there are at least 4 Union Jacks on Patrick Street here. Obviously, that doesn't prove anything, but it is true to say that the big business owners on Patrick Street were more likely than not to be Protestant and more likely than the general population to be pro-unionist. In other words, the British forces managed to ostracize and alienate the only significant group in the city that still had any sort of respect for them. So again, a total PR disaster. When the city was rebuilt, Patrick Street was physically a different environment, but also in terms of its kind of ecology, I suppose. There were substantially fewer businesses on the street. This chart shows businesses on the south side of the street from number 1 to 63. And in 1916, there were 83 firms and only 73 in 1930. If you exclude the professional services like banking and insurance, the drop is actually more significant, from 74 to 55. So there were 19 businesses that never came back on the street, especially those involved in medical and dental services. Some of the small jewelers who'd been so badly affected by the raids and the looting, they never reopened. Tobacconists, chemists, a lot of the smaller shops. So what did happen? Well, these two maps from the Cork City Library collection show the corner near Cash's and Roach's at the top of Winthrop Street. And what you can see is that where once there had been a number of small, kind of knocked together, higgledy-piggledy buildings, the rebuilding shows much larger, more economical, more efficient department stores, much more in tune with the then modern ways of doing business. So what happened is the sites were coalesced, and some people like William Roach did extremely well out of the Burning of Cork and went on to build a very significant business empire that stood for most of the next century. So by 1949, as this aerial shot shows, the modern cityscape had taken shape. You see all of the large department stores running down Patrick Street here, across the river, the City Hall and civic offices, and the damage has been completely repaired. But as I mentioned, it was a mixed story, and the modern department stores definitely did best out of this process. So one of the most notable losses from the Burning of Cork was what were called the municipal buildings, what we tend to call the City Hall these days. This building stood on what's now Terence McSweeney Quay, which was then Albert Quay, and had served as a corn exchange before being taken over by the City Council. As well as hosting the offices, it also hosted a council chamber and the City Hall itself, which is the large public room that we meet in rather than the entire building. Now, in the short term, the City Council had to decamp with whatever they could save from the wreckage. Incidentally, we lost most of our records, civic records in the fire. And they set up their business, they set up their offices in Fitzgerald's Park, in the museum that's currently the public museum, and ran the City Council from that and various other buildings around the city. And for a couple of years, nothing really happened in terms of reconstruction. Now, it's not hard to figure out why nothing happened, because obviously shortly after the Burning of Cork, the War of Independence went into even more of a deadly stage, and following that and the treaty, there was the Civil War. So it really wasn't until 1922, 1923 before anything actually happened significant in terms of reconstruction. One of the ideas floated was to move the city offices to an entirely new site. This map, which was published in 1922, shows the Grand Parade with civic buildings facing the end of the Grand Parade, more or less in the site where the tax office or force used to stand, which has been derelict for a number of years, and which was in the ownership of the City Council. So this was a fairly far-reaching scheme. It would have involved bridging over much of the south channel of the river, creating 2 new public gardens and some other public buildings, an extension to the South Mall and an extension to Patrick Street to make a more modern city on a grid. In fact, the entire thing feels very American or perhaps French, with this long avenue punctuated by by the Berwick Fountain and the National Monument, and in the background, the civic buildings. This would have been quite a grand change to the city centre. And it would have linked the civic government more closely with the business community physically. Now, unfortunately, it would have also been quite a tight site. The scope for extending those buildings would have been very limited because the City Council didn't own the other land. But in the end, probably what scuppered this was a lack of money. This would have been a serious civil engineering project and quite complicated in terms of buying and knocking down buildings that already existed. In the end, as most of us know, the City Hall and offices were rebuilt on the old site. And this is an image from the Examiner again, about 1935, and you can see the building is nearing completion. They're just putting the scaffolding up and finishing the cupola. You can also see that parts of the old corn exchange still exist in the front here. Now, that construction work did not actually start till 1932. but the design was created in 1923. So there was a 9-year delay between actually agreeing on a design and laying the foundation stone. But there was a quite clear process by which this was done, and a competition, a national competition was launched to select the best design. The brief was quite open, and I'll just read a little bit of it here to you. The style of architecture and the materials to be employed are left to the discretion of the competitors, but it is essential that the buildings should be of good architectural character, expressive of their purpose, and without necessary elaboration. That's very key. It is desired that Irish materials shall be used as far as possible. Again, this is a very important point, and you see this kind of narrative of buy Irish, guaranteed Irish coming through the whole rebuilding process. In the end, 11 entries were made to the competition, and it was judged by a man called Lucius O'Callaghan, who was then the director of the National Gallery of Ireland. He was well qualified to do the job. He was a minor architect, but he knew what he was doing, let's put it that way. In the end, this building by Jones and Kelly of Dublin won the competition, and it is quite an austere building. It's also quite a traditional building, and you can see one of the inspiration, perhaps the main inspiration for it, was the Customs House in Dublin in terms of its composition, in terms of it being on the riverside, and also in terms of it being built in the classical style, although quite a lot more pared down than the Customs House, which was, an 18th century building. The greatest influence on it was probably the previous building, the Corn Exchange. But if you look around the building, and I advise you to do this on a nice sunny day, you can see the quality of the stone cutting, the quality of the materials really shines. This is an extremely fine building. But if you remember the brief talking about unnecessary elaboration, and you look carefully at the details cut in the stonework, you'll see that yes, they're there, yes, they're classical, but they're quite sparse, quite austere. Now, the tender price for this building from Sisks was £66,000, which in modern money is about 130 million euro. So not a small amount of money by any means. But the city council knew before any stone was laid that this was never going to pay for the building. They had reckoned this building would cost about £120,000 in 1923 money. In the end, it cost £140,000. So it was over budget even then. And I haven't yet been able to find where the missing money came from. What had happened was, after the fire, the local businesses and the city council applied for compensation from the British government. There was a long and protracted series of discussions about how much was lost and how much needed to be paid, and proof was sought of the firms and council of the items that had been destroyed in the fire. Obviously, part of the problem was all of the inventories and stock books and everything had also been destroyed in the fire, so it was quite hard for firms to say exactly what was in their premises or the City Hall when it was lost. The British government paid £65,000 to the Irish government to replace the City Hall. I'm still unclear where the missing money came from. Hopefully further research will clarify that. Now, in terms of its design, it was quite a conservative design and looked back to pre-war buildings, especially in Britain. You can just glance across and look at the old town hall in Marylebone in London and the City Hall, paying particular attention to the entranceway here, the double height columns, the little pavilions at the side, and the attic at the top are all very similar to our City Hall. So even though this building was built after independence, and even though the previous building was burnt by British forces, the design of this building is very much British. And there are little things like the carillon in the City Hall, when it chimes the Westminster chimes of London. So there's still a mindset that even though independence has come, there's still a reference back to the old regime. Another loss in the Burning of Cork was our lovely Carnegie Library, which had only been standing for about 15 years and was designed by the city engineer and architect, Henry Cutler. Its replacement on the Grand Parade took many years to complete, and it wasn't until 1928 that it opened. The designers of this were Bartholomew O'Flynn and Dominic Mary O'Connor, and it's quite a different building to the previous building. Austere again, but kind of pared down and quite modern looking in comparison with the old brick building with the stone facings. But most of the money that the British government paid out and most of the rebuilding in Cork was concentrated on Patrick Street. And the body responsible for kind of approving the designs in Cork was a thing called the Cork Reconstruction Committee, which was set up by the City Council and acted, I suppose, a bit like a planning authority because there wasn't really a planning authority in Cork at the time. So they made decisions on acceptable designs and parapet heights and style and stuff that could be used. And I mentioned earlier that all the businesses put in insurance claims, and some of these insurance claims were absolutely eye-watering. Egan's, the jewellers, put in for £100,000, which is about £160 million in today's money. Roaches put in for 250,000, which is about 140 million in today's money, and Cash's put in the same. The Munster Arcade put in for what's equivalent to about 240 million, £250 million of damages. Now, I suspect that they didn't think that they'd get all of that money, and they may have slightly over-egged their insurance claim. In the event, the people who suffered damage got between maybe a third and a half of actually what they looked for. So in the cases of Cash's, they built this fine store for £74,000. Now, you wouldn't buy much in Cork today for £74,000, but in 1925, you would have built over 100 council houses for £75,000. So you need to look at Cash's and realise that's like looking at, I don't know, McCurtain's Villas or part of Grona Broher. This is a serious chunk of money. And when you look at the building, a bit like the City Hall, the quality just shines through. Quality of the stonework, some of it is imported from England, but even the little details, like the little Cash's plaque at the bottom of the screen, there is a number of these under each of the windows. Even if you look high up in the building, you see specially made hoppers for collecting the rainwater, and they say Cash's as well. So no expense was spared in this. The best of design, the best of materials. And the building with this lovely bow front makes a beautiful sweep down the street, inviting you into Winthrop Street. If you compare it to the previous building, you can see that it's cobbled together out of 3 different buildings with different floor heights. So it was a huge improvement in terms of business efficiency for Cash's, that everything was on the same floor and much more spacious. A similar story can be found in the Munster Arcade, which is now Penny's, as we all know. If you look carefully at the top of the building here on the pediment, you'll see the arms of Munster. So that's an easy way of remembering, if you didn't know, that this is the Munster Arcade. Like Cash's, this building replaces a couple of very attractive Victorian buildings, but again, with completely different floor heights and ceiling heights and much more awkward to do business around. The new building has these large, prominent first floor windows, which can be used for merchandising and display alongside the ground floor windows. So it's much more modern looking in terms of the way the business is running, but also it's kind of has this kind of toned down classicism, which was very much of its period in the early 1920s. Some buildings in Cork were rebuilt after the fire, even though they hadn't been particularly badly damaged. One example is the Winthrop Arcade, which is, as you know, runs from Oliver Plunkett Street to Winthrop Street. Includes a number of shops and the Ulster Bank on Winthrop Street. Now, this was quite a departure, again, in Cork, this idea of having a shopping arcade, internal mall, I suppose. Again, if you walk through the Winthrop Arcade and look at things like the quality of the woodwork and metalwork and the floors and everything in there, it is very high quality. So it's a sense that businesses in the city are responding to their competitors opening these grand new shops, and they want to have make a modern offer to their customers, something different, something new. The first building to be reconstructed on Patrick Street was actually Egan's, the jeweller, which now trades as Vera Moda and Jack and Jones. And this again is a nice, sober limestone building. And you'll notice that at the top of the building, the parapet of the building is exactly lined up with the parapets either side, so that the street has an even appearance. Even though the buildings themselves are different, there's some sort of similarity to the overall scheme. And this is in total contrast to the original buildings, which were very snaggle-toothed like this, even in the cases of individual buildings. The government offices and Roche's stores, which was Debenhams until fairly recently and is now in a state of flux, I suppose, was owned by William Roche. And as I mentioned, William did extremely well out of the fire. He had a small business, and by the 1930s he had a large business, and by the 1950s and 60s Roche's stores was a nationwide chain. And it was a Cork-founded business, as was Dunn Stores, which came a little later. Now, William was very smart, and he actually leased out the upper floors of his department store to the government to run offices out of. And for many years, the tax office was based in there. So he was getting rent from the government, as well as profits, as well as compensation from the British government. He was winning every way, but obviously he was taking a risk and speculating too. It paid off for him. Now, in terms of the style of the building, the architects for this were Chillingworth and Levy, who were a relatively new firm in Cork at the time. And they adopted the idea of a Renaissance palace, a palazzo, a fortified, semi-fortified house, in terms of its bulk, in terms of its relationship with the street, being right on the edge of the street. So again, another kind of classical building, but it's kind of more playful than Egan's. If you look at Egan's, it's very serious and trustworthy and sober. And Roche's is a little bit more flashy, a little bit more consumerist, a little bit more easy to enjoy, I suppose. Now, this firm of Chillingworth and Levy, a bit like William Roche himself, they did very well out of the fire. They got a lot of work in the city and in the suburbs, and we'll see some more earlier in a while. Another firm who did well out of this were Burton's, which traded until very recently as Oasis, and again is another building in flux. Burton's had been in business in Cork before the fire. They had a small shop kind of nearer where Fitzgerald's Menswear is today. But after the fire, they managed to get their hands on a much more prestigious site and built this really quite large store for their menswear. Now, the designer credited is a man called William Hill, who was related to Henry Horton Hill, who designed Cash's. But there's a strong possibility that a man called Harry Wilson, who was a Yorkshire architect, had as a hand in this too, because he was their kind of corporate designer. And Burton's are one of those first businesses that start branding their buildings. We're all used to the idea now that you go to a McDonald's, it has the golden arches, and one McDonald's looks pretty much like another McDonald's, and there are many, many businesses like that in the world today. But one of the first to start making their buildings look like they were all owned and run by the same entity was Burton's. And if you carefully look at the parapet of Burton's next time you're on Patrick Street or on Google Street View, you will see that carved up here very smartly, it says, Montague Burton, the tailor of taste. In terms of design, this building is quite an American style building. The immediate ancestors might be somewhere like Cleary's of Dublin or Selfridge's in London, but Selfridge's was designed by an architect from Chicago, and it was a very American style store and an American style architecture. So in Cork, in Burton's, we have a Cork building which came to us via Dublin and Leeds and London from Chicago. Given the cause of the fires, in other words, the British forces who burnt the city, one would have expected quite a lot of Irish national symbols or design in the newly reconstructed buildings to show the importance of independence, to show that the country essentially was under new management. But in fact, there's very little of this Celtic revival or Irish design. If you look at the city library at the top, you will see the harp and some knotwork, and on the balcony some beautifully carved triskelei and little kind of creatures out of the Book of Kells, or of inspiration. Egan's, Veramoda, the Egans were a very nationalist family, and it's not surprising then to see on their shop, you see more Celtic design as well. But that's about it, really. One of the losing designs for the City Hall was in the Celtic revival style, but it didn't get placed, and it didn't win a prize, and it didn't get built. The city councillors seem to be probably happier to have something more traditional and more like the old building that they had lost. And so it wasn't the case that just because you were under new management, a national Irish Sinn Féin dominated government, therefore you would have lots of national symbols everywhere. It was more subtle than that. Perhaps one of the less expected outcomes of the Burning of Cork was the development of social housing. We tend to think of the reconstruction being, as I've mentioned already, the City Hall, the library, and Patrick Street, focused on those areas, and then, a little bit further out. But one of the outcomes of it was the development of the Capwell Estate, Capwell Road and Capwell Avenue. And how this came about was slightly convoluted. The city government had been in the business of building social housing since the 1880s, and since independence had built 3 big estates in Cork, well, 1 small one and 2 big ones. So these weren't the first social housing or corporation housing built by the Irish Free State in Cork. But what happened was, when the money eventually came through to rebuild the City Hall, the 65,000 that I mentioned, the city manager at the time, a man called Philip Monaghan, persuaded the city councillors that instead of building modern, cushy, expensive offices for themselves, that money should be used to build social housing for the homeless or the needy in Cork. And as a result, the money was put into an account, and these 158 houses in Capwell were built. And if you look at them, you'll notice that they're in fairly short terraces of 4 or 6. And you'll notice that the houses on the end are a slightly different design to the ones in the middle, and I suspect maybe slightly bigger. They're turned through 90 degrees, the doors on the side. But the most obvious thing is good-sized front gardens on most of the houses, and back gardens too. And because of the nature of the site, some of these back gardens are really quite considerable. And this is a totally different kind of way of laying out council housing to somewhere like Barrett's buildings, or Horgan's buildings, or Kelleher's buildings, or the previous developments, where you had long rows of terraced houses, either bungalows or small 2-story houses with a yard at the back and right on the front of the street. This is suburbia, essentially. This is the beginnings of Cork's suburbs. Well, strictly speaking, I suppose you could say there were a number of larger one-off houses in places like Tivoli and Sunday as well, but this is when suburbia starts to become a thing that people can all aspire to. And one of the unusual things in Cork is that the first people to build these suburbs weren't private property speculators and private developers. The first people to build these were the local authority. And the private sector went, hang on a minute, that looks interesting. We could do something like that. People will want to buy that. And they copied. They ripped off, if you like, the public sector. They made the houses slightly bigger, and they probably built more semis than little terraces, but essentially they took the idea from the public sector, and this idea has essentially, to this day, is the basis for almost all housing in Cork and in Ireland. The Capwell Estate included a number of semi-detached houses, such as these two. And you can even see in this one I've shown because this has the original wooden sash windows. Obviously, over time, quite a lot of these things have rotted and had to be replaced, but this is how the houses looked more or less the day they were finished in 1926. And to a family moving, say, from the Marsh out to a house like this was a life-changing moment for them. To have the space, the fresh air, the freedom. And don't forget, at the time, there was a tram service literally running past the door down Southern Road. You could get in and out to town in a few minutes, but still, have the benefits of being in the country almost. I mentioned that as well as the city centre, there was an amount of damage in Dillon's Cross. And without wishing to repeat Michael's show, there'd been an ambush in Dillon's Cross which had kind of kicked off and lit the blue touch paper for the terrible events of the night of the 11th. But Dillon's Cross had a very important place in nationalist iconography in the city at the time. Even the name is suggestive. Some people called it Barracks Crossroads, but most people call it Dillon's Cross, and did in 1920. It was named after a man called Bryan Dillon, usually spelt with a Y at the time, who was one of the most senior members of the Cork Fenians. And in 1909, a plaque was unveiled on a house at the top of what's now Ballyhooly New Road, and it was unveiled in his memory. And you can see on the left a photograph from the Cork Examiner of a platform being set up in memory of our patriot dead, it says in front of it, and a public speech being given, and a considerable crowd of people assembled to hear it and hear about the exploits of Bryan Dillon. You'll notice a couple of individuals wearing plumed hats, members probably of the Irish National Foresters, which was kind of a friendly society, nationalist-friendly society, a bit like the Orange Order, except for nationalists. And Bryan Dillon was a significant figure in the nationalist iconography of Cork, and this plaque was very important. If we look at the right-hand photograph, you see what is a British Army tank. You can see the gun here sticking out the side. And about 2 years earlier, this tank was serving on the Western Front. This is a very up-to-date piece of military equipment. Maybe not the most modern tank around, but certainly a very lethal and deadly piece of gear. And you kind of realize how serious the situation in Cork was in 1920, that in Collins Barracks, which was then Victoria Barracks, they just happened to have a few battlefield tanks hanging around, So there was obviously an expectation that something like this might be needed. Now, in fact, the tank is being used as a battering ram, and this gable wall, which you can see here on the left-hand photograph, this is the same gable wall being rammed by the tank on the right-hand photograph. And you can see it says Dillon's Cross Meat Market. There was a butcher's shop in that building. So you have the fact the place is named after Bryan Dillon. You have his memorial and this nationalist meeting, and there were a number of other nationalist rallies in the area. You have the fact that the building was burnt by the British Army, that there was an IRA ambush on the site, and now you have it being demolished by the British Army shortly afterwards. So there's a lot of meaning tied up in this particular corner of Cork City. Now, like other places in Cork, it took a number of years before the reconstruction started. And it wasn't until 1924, that the buildings in Dillon's Cross were replaced. And this is what replaced them. Somewhat miraculously, the plaque had been saved from the original building, although I think the little bust of Dillon was recreated. It's not the same as the one in the earlier photographs. And it was reset with great ceremony back into the facade of their brand new building on the site. But what's striking is, given all of that politics and the history and the violence surrounding that site, is the architect, whomever they were, and I haven't managed to find out who designed this, and the city council under the reconstruction committee approved the design of a building which is very, to my eyes at least, very English, with the black and white woodwork at the front here and the gallery hanging over the street, okay? Now, just because it looks English to my eyes, and maybe to yours, I can't obviously know, doesn't mean that that's how it looked to the people who made the decisions at the time. But it does, I suppose, raise kind of certain questions about the relationship between architectural style, right, and the history of this place. So I'll leave you thinking about that. And I would just like to, conclude with these comments here and my thanks to all of these people and organizations. So in conclusion, aside from the larger political and military ramifications of the burning of Cork, in the long term, architecturally speaking, the event was actually good for the city, especially for the big businesses, the large department stores. It wasn't so great for some of those small traders who just lost heart or couldn't get back into business or decided to sell up and move on. But the big stores, the Cash's, the Winthrop Arcade, Grant's department store, they now had buildings which were fit for purpose and which they used for the next 20, 30, 40, or in the case of Cash's, 100 years. And this was a game changer for them. The designs that the architects came up with for these new buildings were what you'd call state of the art at the time in terms of the way they were constructed and the way they looked, but they weren't really totally new departures. They were very much more in the vein of what other people were doing, which I think, again, is probably appropriate for large department stores. On the whole, they're not interested in being radical. The city council obviously lost an awful lot from this event that can't be replaced, such as historical documents, leases, city minutes, things that would be great use to the city council and also to historians such as myself. But they did gain something they'd never had before. In the long history of Cork City, Cork had never had a purpose-made, dedicated building that contained a city hall, municipal offices, and a council chamber. This was the first time in 1935, was the first time that Cork City had all of this on one site in a dedicated building designed for them. So by the 1930, Cork City Centre was set up for the requirements of 20th century retail. And the buildings that they put up stood the test of time for many years. But now, as we're aware, there are new changes in retail happening. The recent coronavirus lockdowns have changed, perhaps forever, the way that we shop. And when one looks at Patrick Street now, you can sense that there is change coming again. There's a big difference between an Amazon fulfillment center and Roach's stores. And questions have to be raised about what is the future of these large department stores. If you walk down Patrick Street, not just the large stores, but many of the smaller ones, you'll see above first floor level, they're effectively empty, and some of them are in unstable condition. And others, if neglect happens, will go that way too. So some acts of imagination, architectural interventions, and government and local policy will have to be geared together to try and find a future for these places. So on that thought, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.